A forbidden romance, 2 vast fortunes, and a legacy that silenced her enemies. Behind velvet and glitter, Arabella Huntington played a game of scandal that an entire age could not ignore. Picture this: a young girl born in the dark streets of Richmond, Virginia, surrounded by gambling halls, brothels and slave auctions, with poverty as her only inheritance. Yet from those harsh beginnings, she stepped into the drawing rooms of America's richest men. Every move she made carried whispers of deception, ambition, and a forbidden love. For 14 years, she lived quietly in the role of mistress to one of the most powerful railroad barons in America, while New York's high society shut her out of their glittering ballrooms. They scorned her past, but Arabella turned rejection into fire. What began as scandal, she reshaped into strategy. What society branded as shame, she transformed into power. And Arabella's story did not end with a single fortune, but with 2. United in a marriage so audacious that even the most hardened gossips of the Gilded Age were left speechless. Tonight, we peel back the myths and follow Arabella Huntington, the woman who built an empire on scandal, defied every locked door, and forced history to remember her while those who scorned her faded into silence. Scandal or strategy? Love or calculation? This is Old Time Docs, uncovering the untold story of Arabella Huntington. Mid-19th century Richmond was a city split in 2. On one side, stately avenues lined with brick townhouses and tobacco warehouses. On the other, narrow lanes heavy with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and despair. It was in this second Richmond, in the shadows of hotels and gambling parlours, that Arabella Duval Yarrington drew her first breath around 1850. Her father, an innkeeper of modest means, died when she was still a child, leaving her mother Catherine to keep a boarding house in Shockoe Bottom, the roughest quarter of the city. Shockoe was infamous. Its streets echoed with the clatter of dice, the laughter spilling out of brothels, and the cries from the slave auction block that stood only a few streets away. To grow up, there was to witness daily how money could purchase not only pleasure but also human lives. Respectability was a currency few could afford, and for young Arabella, survival meant absorbing lessons far different from those learned by the daughters of Richmond's elite. Inside her mother's boarding house, she saw men arrive with promises and leave with debts. She watched women barter charm for protection. She listened to whispers about fortunes won overnight and lost by morning. Such sights etched themselves deeply into her mind. Psychologists today might call it formative environment conditioning, a childhood where every interaction taught that appearances could be deceiving, trust was fragile, and power belonged to those who knew how to bend rules without breaking them in public. For Arabella, the neighborhood became an unintentional school of strategy. She saw how the respectable facade of a wedding ring or a gentleman's coat could conceal vice, and she learned that survival often required performance. By adolescence, she was already rewriting small details of her identity, her age, her birthplace, testing how easily the world could be persuaded to see what she wanted it to see. These were not childish lies, but survival rehearsals. In a society that judged women by lineage and virtue, she had neither. What she possessed instead was resilience and the quiet conviction that poverty need not be permanent if one mastered the art of reinvention. That conviction hardened into resolve around 1869, when at just 19 she executed her boldest deception yet. In the rough quarters of Shockoe Bottom, the guests at her mother's boarding house were not only labourers and drifters, but gamblers, liquor dealers and adventurers living on society's margins. It was in this world that Arabella first encountered John Archer Worsham, a notorious gambling hall operator with connections in every tavern and cardroom in Richmond. Arabella was not a dazzling beauty in the conventional sense, but she possessed a strange, magnetic allure. She was slender, with a long, expressive face, dark hair usually drawn back, and eyes that seemed both vulnerable and calculating. That mixture, fragility that invited protection and sharpness that demanded respect, was precisely what caught Worsham's attention. Their first meeting, as stories later recalled, took place at the boarding house when Worsham arrived with a circle of gambling friends looking for rooms. Amid the din of laughter, dice and cheap whiskey, Arabella appeared with calm composure, her gaze sweeping the men as if she were silently measuring each one. Worsham, accustomed to women who flattered or pleaded for favours, instantly sensed she was different. Soon, their encounters moved beyond chance meetings. They began to meet discreetly, in taverns thick with cigar smoke, in back rooms where Worsham felt like a petty king holding court. For Arabella, these moments were less romance than apprenticeship, opportunities to study how men bargained, how influence was bought, and how appearances could be spun into power. For Worsham, it was the thrill of showing off a striking young woman, clever, poised, and just beautiful enough to make other men jealous. Desire and calculation overlapped. To Worsham, Arabella was like a rare jewel in the smoky world of cards and liquor, a young woman nearly 30 years his junior, who both satisfied his desires and unsettled his reason. Their relationship advanced quickly. Meetings in the boarding house or in gambling rooms soon turned into promises of marriage. But Arabella knew well, this was no romance, but an arrangement. The marriage gave her the title of Mrs. Worsham, a facade respectable enough to enter New York society, while Worsham, already legally married in Richmond, could not publicly object. It was a union of convenience, not affection. For John, Arabella's presence burnished the image of a successful player. For Arabella, Worsham was nothing more than a one-way ticket out of impoverished Richmond. And from the moment of that false wedding, the door to Collis P. Huntington stood wider open than ever before. The following year, she gave birth to a son, Archer Milton Worsham. His true parentage was never publicly admitted, but the whispers pointed to Collis. Soon after, John Worsham quietly returned to his legal wife, leaving Arabella a convenient widow. By 21, she had transformed herself from a poor girl in Shockoe Bottom into a woman with social cover, a child to secure her future, and proximity to one of the richest men in America. The lessons of Richmond's rough streets had not been wasted. She had learned that survival demanded masks, and that scandal, if managed shrewdly, could be converted into strategy. This was only her opening gambit. From the moment Arabella became a widow, her world expanded far beyond Richmond's narrow streets. New York in the 1870s pulsed with ambition, steamships crowding the piers, Fifth Avenue glowing with new mansions, and railroad fortunes multiplying overnight. Among the titans who shaped this restless city stood Collis P. Huntington, one of the legendary Big Four railroad barons whose steel lines stitched the continent together. Arabella's path crossed his not in a glittering ballroom but through quieter circles of business and art patronage. Her title, Mrs. Worsham, and the mystery surrounding her only sharpened his curiosity. Introductions were discreet. A dinner at a mutual friend's home, a chance encounter in an art dealer's showroom, conversations that lingered long after others had left. Huntington, then in his 50s and already a national power, recognized in Arabella not merely beauty but a calm intelligence rare in any salon. She, in turn, recognized in him the ultimate opportunity, a man whose fortune could secure the freedom and cultural standing she intended to claim. What began as polite conversation deepened into a hidden partnership. By the early 1870s, while society whispered and speculated, Arabella was quietly entering Huntington's orbit, first as a confidant, then as something far closer. Every visit to his offices, every late-night carriage ride through Manhattan's gas-lit streets was another step away from the world that had once confined her. For the next 14 years, Arabella lived in the shadow of Collis P. Huntington's empire, not as his wife but as his mistress. To modern ears that might sound like humiliation. Yet for Arabella, it was a calculated apprenticeship, one of the longest and most patient acts of self-reinvention in Gilded Age history. While Collis remained legally bound to his first wife Elizabeth, Arabella quietly built a parallel life in New York under the name Mrs. Worsham. She appeared on Fifth Avenue and in the city's drawing rooms, but she was never truly welcome. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, and the other gatekeepers of the 400 considered her tainted, a woman of questionable beginnings who had slipped into society through the back door. And the most formidable of those gatekeepers had a name: Ward McAllister. In Gilded Age New York, he was more than a socialite. He was the self-appointed guardian of high society, a man who claimed to know exactly who belonged and who never would. McAllister became famous for inventing the 400, the exclusive list of families he deemed the true aristocracy of the city. To be on that list was to hold a passport to every glittering ballroom. To be left off, it was to be invisible, no matter how vast the fortune. At first, McAllister seemed willing to open a door. He quietly accepted a generous payment from Collis Huntington to arrange a formal introduction for Arabella. But when the negotiations broke down, some say Collis balked at paying the full amount, others that McAllister caught the scent of scandal. His charm turned to ice. Rather than helping, he spread the whispers that blacklisted her permanently. In a world where reputation was everything, one man's gossip could wipe out the social power of even the greatest fortune, and McAllister knew it. For Arabella, this was more than a personal slight. It was a public sentence: no Astor ballroom, no Vanderbilt dinner, no entry into the very circle she needed to legitimize her future. But she did not beg, and she did not bend. Instead, she treated McAllister's snub as proof of her own strength and as fuel to build something that no list and no man could ever keep her from. Denied access to the grandest ballrooms, she turned exile into a training ground. She invested her time and Collis's generosity into ventures that built her independence. Real estate became her first weapon. In 1877, she bought prime Manhattan property and later sold it at a profit directly to John D. Rockefeller. Few women of her era dared to enter the battlefield of robber barons. Arabella not only entered but left her mark, proving she could match wits with the men who ruled finance. She also cultivated an eye for art, filling her West 54th Street home with French landscapes and aesthetic movement furniture. These were not mere decorations, they were signals to herself and to others that she belonged to a cultural world more enduring than the shallow hierarchies of New York society. Every painting acquired, every parcel of land traded was a brick in a fortress she was building against judgment. Psychologically, her patience can be understood as delayed gratification, a willingness to absorb insult today to reap power tomorrow. She accepted the role of mistress not as an end, but as a temporary mask, knowing that time and inevitability would work in her favour. Every gift from Collis, from jewels to houses, was carefully folded into her long-term security. And in this patience lay her genius. She realised that legitimacy in the eyes of society mattered far less than legitimacy in the eyes of the law. When the day came that Elizabeth Huntington died, Arabella would be perfectly positioned to step into the legal role of wife, with all the protections and inheritance rights it entailed. She understood what many women of her time could not. That respectability was a fragile cloak, but wealth, once secured, could not be taken away. Still, the stigma weighed on her. Walking down Fifth Avenue, she would have seen the carriages of women who mocked her absence from their gatherings. Yet, Arabella never fought for their approval. Instead, she used exclusion as proof of their fear. Fear that a woman born with nothing could, by calculation alone, stand equal to them in wealth and taste. For 14 years, she played this waiting game, a performance as demanding as any stage actress's role. And when the curtain finally rose with Elizabeth's death in 1884, Arabella was ready to claim her part. Her patience had been extraordinary. The only question was whether marriage would finally erase her past, or whether the past would follow her into her new life as the wife of Collis P. Huntington. When Elizabeth Huntington died in 1884, Collis wasted no time. After 14 years of secrecy, whispers and calculated patience, he married Arabella in his San Francisco home. The ceremony was performed by none other than Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, one of the most famous preachers in America, whose reputation had only recently survived a scandal of his own. 4 crisp $1,000 bills changed hands as his fee, a price that spoke less of religion and more of redemption. Arabella, once the hidden mistress, was now Mrs. Collis P. Huntington. For Collis, it was both a declaration and a settlement. He formally adopted Arabella's son, Archer, tacitly admitting the boy's true paternity and securing his place as heir. For Arabella, it was the culmination of 2 decades of endurance, a legal bond that gave her not only wealth, but permanence. Yet legitimacy on paper did not translate into legitimacy in society. New York's grandees remembered too well the whispers of Richmond, the sham marriage, the years in the shadows. No matter how vast the Huntington fortune, no invitation arrived from the Astor's ballroom, no recognition from the Vanderbilts. Ward McAllister's gossip had done its work. Arabella's name remained stained in the eyes of those who guarded the gates of high society. It was a cruel paradox of the Gilded Age. Money could build railroads across a continent, but could not purchase a seat at the right dinner table. Arabella, however, understood that exclusion was not defeat. With Collis at her side and Archer's future secured, she shifted her energy toward the 2 things she knew could outlast gossip: property and culture. She spent lavishly, yes, on jewels, gowns, and the finest pearls Paris could provide, but each purchase carried a deeper meaning. Her homes became living galleries of ambition and taste. Inside, the walls glowed with progressive French landscapes by Corot and Daubigny, the mists and woods rendered in brushstrokes that whispered of freedom and refinement. Rooms opened like theatre sets of the aesthetic movement. Gilded 18th century French commodes, carved salon chairs that seemed to ripple like silk, enormous mirrors catching candlelight and scattering it like starlight. In a private chamber hung Cabanel's hypnotic Ophelia. A woman half submerged in mystery, her red velvet and black lace a declaration that beauty could be both soft and unyielding. And then came the jewels, dazzling as constellations. Arabella assembled ropes of rare black pearls, diamonds and platinum tiaras, and intricate brooches whose workmanship rivaled that of European royalty. To the untrained eye, they were ornaments. To Arabella, they were statements of power. Frozen lightning meant to outlast every gossip and gatekeeper. Many were kept in private salons rather than on public display, as if to prove that true magnificence needs no audience and real power requires no witnesses. Every canvas, every carved chair, every hidden jewel was a brick in a cultural fortress she was building, one that no Astor or Vanderbilt could storm. By surrounding herself with art and gems that outshone even the Vanderbilt treasures, Arabella was crafting an image of sophistication that society might scorn, but history could never erase. Each piece of jewelry was a cultural memory distilled into metal and gemstones. A necklace could tell the story of bustling early-century Paris, where she negotiated with the finest master jewelers. A tiara carried the breath of European palaces, as if Arabella were placing herself on equal footing with the old aristocracy. Still, the tension lingered. Walking down Fifth Avenue, Arabella could see the glittering mansions of those who mocked her absence from their circles. But she also knew what they could not admit aloud, that wealth in America was shifting away from old pedigrees and toward the ruthless self-made. The Vanderbilts themselves had once been sneered at as upstarts. Now they were arbiters of taste. Arabella grasped the irony and turned it inward. If she could not sit at their tables, she would build her own halls, lavish, luminous, and filled with treasures they could only dream of acquiring. And with Collis aging and increasingly dependent on her counsel, she knew her position was secure. By the turn of the century, Arabella had endured scorn, reinvented herself, and cemented her place beside one of America's greatest fortunes. But destiny had another turn waiting. When Collis died in 1900, Arabella's patience was rewarded on a scale few could imagine. She would inherit not merely jewels and houses, but nearly 2/3 of a railroad empire. Yet the real question was not how much she gained, but how she would wield it, and whether the stigma of her past would finally fade or tighten its grip as she stepped into widowhood. Collis P. Huntington's health had been weakening for years. The man who once crossed the Sierra Nevada to lay tracks for the Central Pacific now found even the climb of a staircase exhausting. He suffered from a diseased heart and hardening of the arteries, conditions doctors of the day could do little to treat. Seeking cooler air and relief, he retreated that summer to his private camp on Roquette Lake in the Adirondacks. There, on August 13, 1900, while quietly reading after breakfast, he felt a sudden tightness in his chest. Before his attendants could summon help, the Titan of rail collapsed. Within minutes, the builder of America's steel spine was gone. With that final sigh, Arabella's long game reached its turning point. Newspapers across the nation reported his passing as the end of an era, the railroad baron who had stitched together the steel spine of America. Yet, hidden beneath the headlines was another story, no less extraordinary. The rise of a widow who now held in her hands a fortune beyond imagination. Arabella inherited more than $50 million, an amount equal to nearly $2 billion in today's currency. It was not just wealth. It was power on a scale that made even the Astors glance uneasily in her direction. 2/3 of Collis's empire was now hers, while the remaining third passed to his nephew, Henry E. Huntington. In that division lay the seeds of both cooperation and conflict, a family arrangement that would set the stage for Arabella's most daring move yet. To the outside world, she was finally secure. She had waited, endured whispers, accepted humiliation, and emerged as one of the wealthiest women in America. Yet inside her Fifth Avenue mansion, Arabella must have felt a more complicated truth. Money could silence creditors, bribe editors, and purchase jewels. But it had not silenced memory. To New York's gatekeepers, she was still the woman from Richmond, the mistress who had married her way upward, the social outsider who would never be welcomed into their inner circle. Their parties continued without her. Her name never graced McAllister's vaunted lists. It was the cruel irony of her triumph. She now owned more than many of those who had excluded her, but exclusion still clung to her like a shadow. Arabella's response was not to retreat, but to build. She expanded her art collecting with new ferocity, acquiring works that no other American could match. In pearls alone, she spent $300,000 in 1906. At the time, the largest single jewelry purchase ever recorded in the Western world. Her personal expenditures were staggering. More than $4,000 on lingerie in 1912 from a single Parisian shop, a sum that spoke not merely of indulgence, but of a woman determined to live on her own terms. Critics sneered. Arabella ignored them. To her, extravagance was both shield and statement. If society would not grant her a crown, she would fashion one from diamonds and silk, wearing it in defiance. Still, wealth brought dangers as well as freedoms. In 1905, scandal sheet publisher William Delton Mann tried to blackmail Arabella. He threatened to publish damaging details about her past, her humble beginnings, the sham marriage, and her long years as Collis Huntington's mistress, unless she paid. Arabella stayed calm. She quietly handed over $15,000 to buy his silence, then left for Europe before a court summons could reach her. Only weeks later, Mann himself was sued for libel, forcing him to fight for his own reputation and dropping his threats against her. It was a clean, calculated escape. Arabella protected her name, avoided a public scandal, and let her would-be blackmailer collapse under his own troubles. It was a move that revealed both her vulnerability and her cunning. She could never entirely escape the shadows of her youth, but she knew how to outmaneuver those who tried to use them against her. In psychology, this is what scholars call resilience through reframing, the ability to transform what might destroy you into a tool of survival. Arabella had spent her entire life practicing it. Poverty became ambition, mistresshood became apprenticeship, widowhood became dominion. And yet, even with all her triumphs, one obstacle remained. The Huntington fortune was divided. If she wanted not only wealth, but true cultural immortality, she would need to find a way to reunite the fractured empire. The key, ironically, would come not from her late husband, but from his nephew, Henry. In the years to come, their bond would scandalize even jaded New Yorkers and leave an indelible mark on history. For now, however, Arabella stood at the threshold of widowhood, with the world watching to see what the most notorious heiress in America would dare to do next. In the months following Collis Huntington's death, Arabella's grief was real enough, but so was her sense of unfinished business. She had inherited nearly two-thirds of the Huntington empire, yet the remaining third lay in the hands of Collis's nephew, Henry Edwards Huntington. At first glance, Henry seemed an unlikely partner. Born in 1850, the same year as Arabella herself, he had spent much of his life in the shadow of his uncle, gradually building his own role in the family's sprawling railroad interests. But fate had placed them side by side, bound by wealth, family name, and an unspoken sense that together they could create something larger than either could alone. Henry was different from the older tycoon she'd spent 2 decades alongside. Where Collis had been gruff and calculating, Henry was meticulous, reserved, and deeply drawn to art and culture, the very passions Arabella had cultivated to elevate herself above scandal. Within months of Collis's death, Henry separated from his wife and moved into the Metropolitan Club, just 3 blocks from Arabella's Fifth Avenue mansion. To society, this might have looked like coincidence. To Arabella, it looked like strategy. Their encounters, first discreet and then more frequent, carried the weight of inevitability. She was the wealthy widow whose fortune gave her unrivaled independence. He was the nephew whose inheritance could merge with hers to consolidate an empire. Yet their courtship was anything but ordinary. Henry did not woo Arabella with flowers or sonnets, but with art. At her urging, he spent $577,000 on a set of French Gobelins tapestries called The Noble Pastoral, a single purchase that cost more than the entire construction of his future San Marino estate. It was a gesture that signaled not only devotion, but shared ambition. Arabella understood the language of objects, and Henry spoke it fluently. Each acquisition was both a declaration of affection and a strategic move in the long game of legacy building. For Arabella, the relationship was layered. To be seen with Henry so soon after Collis's death invited whispers of impropriety. To marry him, should it ever come to that, would court outright scandal. But scandal was a currency she had long since learned to spend. Psychologically, one might call this scandal resilience, the ability to turn outrage into spectacle and spectacle into influence. For every raised eyebrow in New York, there were 10 dealers in Paris eager to sell her masterpieces, 10 institutions willing to accept her donations, 10 columnists who could not resist writing her name. Still, the decision was not easy. Arabella was in her 60s, wealthy beyond measure, and could have lived out her years in quiet widowhood. But quiet had never been her aim. To consolidate the Huntington fortune, to transform 2 separate inheritances into one unassailable empire, was a temptation too strong to resist. More than that, Henry gave her something Collis never had: the chance to shape not just wealth, but culture, to build a legacy that would transcend the snobberies of Fifth Avenue and speak to generations unborn. By 1913, after 7 years of careful courtship, Arabella made her choice. At the American church in Paris, 63-year-old Arabella Huntington married 63-year-old Henry, in a union that shocked even scandal-hardened Gilded Age society. The widow had wed her late husband's nephew, and the Huntington empire was, at least in spirit, reunited. To some it was grotesque, to others genius. For Arabella, it was simply the final move in a game she'd been playing since the streets of Richmond, a move that secured not only her fortune but her immortality. What no one could yet know was how far she and Henry would take their shared vision, and how that vision would transform scandal into one of America's greatest cultural legacies. The marriage of Arabella and Henry Huntington in 1913 was more than a union of 2 people. It was the merger of two fortunes and two obsessions. Together, they became what today we might call a power couple, though their power was measured less in dinner invitations than in the paintings and manuscripts that began to flow into their possession. In less than a decade, they would spend more than $21 million on art, an amount so staggering that even Europe's established collectors raised their eyebrows. The centerpiece acquisitions included Gainsborough's The Blue Boy and Lawrence's Pinky, works that instantly made their collection rival anything in America outside of the Metropolitan Museum. To the Vanderbilts and Astors, who had once locked her out of their ballrooms, Arabella now sent a message. She didn't need their approval. She was buying immortality on canvas. Yet this frenzy of collecting was not pure indulgence. Both Arabella and Henry understood that culture was the one form of capital that could not be dismissed as vulgar. A mansion could be mocked as nouveau riche, but a Rembrandt hanging in its gallery was beyond reproach. Dealers like Joseph Duveen, who famously guided the tastes of America's richest families, played a central role in shaping their acquisitions. Duveen had a genius for persuasion, convincing clients that only the rarest and most expensive works could reflect their true status. With Arabella, however, he found a partner who did not simply follow advice, but wielded her own sharp eye. She had spent decades training herself in the subtleties of style and provenance, and she knew how to distinguish between a fad and a masterpiece. This discernment, combined with Henry's resources, allowed them to assemble a collection that was both vast and remarkably coherent. From a psychological perspective, their collecting served more than one purpose. For Arabella, it was redemption. Each painting, another brick in the wall against the insults of her past, each sculpture a tangible proof that she'd risen above the street corners of Richmond. For Henry, it was affirmation. After years in his uncle's shadow, he was finally shaping something that was his own, guided by the woman who had already outplayed New York society. Together, they transformed the act of collecting into a partnership ritual, one that bound them more closely than any ballroom dance could have done. Still, their extravagance drew criticism. Newspapers delighted in reporting Arabella's spending habits: $3,112 for skin creams in 1921, $6,349 for wardrobe alterations in 1921-1923. Adjusted for inflation, these were sums that could have purchased houses. But even the critics had to admit, she was no frivolous spendthrift. Beneath the pearls and Paris gowns was a woman who understood value in its deepest sense. While others squandered their fortunes on temporary pleasures, Arabella and Henry were assembling a cultural arsenal that would outlast them both. Their West Coast estate at San Marino became the center of this ambition. While Arabella preferred the sophistication of New York and Paris, she recognized the potential of Henry's California project. The ranch outside Los Angeles was being reshaped into something unprecedented. Not just a home, but a future institution. With each acquisition, Arabella was not merely decorating her surroundings, she was curating a destiny. And in doing so, she was rewriting the rules of legacy. Society had denied her a place at its table, but she would leave behind a banquet for generations. The question was no longer whether Arabella Huntington would be remembered. It was how far her name would travel, and how completely it would eclipse those who once scorned her. As Arabella moved into her 70s, she had become both an icon of extravagance and a paradox of restraint. Her residences stretched from New York to Paris, but Henry's sprawling ranch at San Marino in California became the unlikely stage for their joint legacy. Though she only spent a couple of months there each year, never quite surrendering her preference for Europe's sophistication, her presence loomed over every decision Henry made. Together, they transformed San Marino from a private estate into the blueprint for something enduring, a cultural institution that would rival anything on the East Coast. Henry envisioned it as a library and gallery open to the public. Arabella, with her instinct for permanence, ensured it would be filled with treasures that spoke of refinement rather than mere wealth. At the same time, Arabella's philanthropy revealed another side of her character. Having once been barred from ballrooms, she now opened doors for others through her money. She funded the Hampton Institute, dedicated to educating freedmen. She quietly gave to Harvard Medical School. She supported the American Geographical Society and the Hispanic Society, founded by her son, Archer. She even provided funds to the women's suffrage movement, though true to her style, she chose to write checks rather than march in parades. For her, power was always most effective when exercised behind the curtain, not in front of a crowd. It was the same principle that had guided her in Collis's Shadow, now applied on a national scale. And yet, even amid such generosity, Arabella never abandoned her appetite for the symbols of luxury. Paris remained her preferred stage for shopping tours, where she commissioned custom gowns from Worth and Cartier jewels that shimmered under gaslight. She was known to order entire wardrobes shipped across the Atlantic, only to have them altered again upon arrival to suit her exacting taste. Visitors recalled that even her private rooms were layered with rare silks, hand-carved furniture, and perfumes from Grasse. Critics called it vanity. Arabella treated presentation as strategy. Clothes, jewels, and interiors were not decoration, but armor. And she wore them knowingly in a world that had long sneered at her origins. For Henry, these years brought fulfillment. He often remarked that, even in his 60s, life seems so very, very sweet, a reflection of the partnership that had invigorated his later life. Arabella had given him not only companionship but also a vision, the chance to channel his fortune into a cultural edifice that would bear his name long after railroads had rusted into memory. Together, they acquired manuscripts, rare books, and artworks on a scale no other American couple could match. Their collecting was no longer about prestige alone. It was about crafting a narrative of civilization itself, with Arabella and Henry as its careful stewards. Still, time was catching up. Arabella, who had spent her life mastering reinvention, could not rewrite mortality. In September 1924, she died in New York, her age recorded ambiguously as 72 to 74, fitting for a woman who had blurred the details of her life from the beginning. Her funeral was not the society spectacle she had once been denied. Instead, her truest monument was already taking shape across the continent at San Marino. Henry, bereft but determined, would continue their shared work until his own death 3 years later. Both were laid to rest in the Temple of the Four Seasons, a white marble rotunda designed by John Russell Pope, the same architect who would later give the nation the Jefferson Memorial. It was a final stage, a theatre of stone, in which Arabella's transformation from pariah to patroness was sealed for good. But the real measure of her triumph was not in marble or jewels. It lived in the manuscripts and paintings, the galleries and gardens that would one day bear the Huntington name and welcome hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. Her enemies had sought to erase her. Instead, Arabella Huntington wrote herself into history in ink, too deep to fade. Arabella Huntington's story does not end with her death in 1924, nor with Henry's passing 3 years later. It lives on in the paradox she embodied. A woman born in obscurity, branded by scandal, yet immortalized through culture. To the society, hostesses of her age, she was forever an intruder, never welcome at their balls. Yet to history, she became something far greater. A patroness whose vision shaped one of the world's leading research centers and gardens. The question her life leaves us with is whether the measure of a person lies in the gossip of their time or the legacy they leave behind. At San Marino, the Huntington Library rose as a treasury of memory, millions of manuscripts and rare volumes, paintings by Gainsborough and Lawrence, letters inked by Jefferson and Franklin. But perhaps the most poetic part of that legacy lies not only in parchment or canvas, but beneath open sky, the gardens. The Japanese garden still carries the stillness of curved bridges and koi ponds. The desert garden, once the largest of its kind in the world, brims with cacti and succulents that were exotic curiosities when first planted. Step into the rose garden, and the air itself seems perfumed, blooming in waves from spring to autumn. Even the later-built Chinese garden feels like a natural extension of their vision, proof that ideals of cross-cultural beauty and learning can keep unfolding long after a lifetime ends. Every path invites not spectacle but reflection, a reminder that beauty, like knowledge, deepens when shared. Visitors during the Depression found solace there that no market crash could erase. Soldiers on wartime leave wrote of spirits restored under the camellias. What Arabella once lacked, the manicured lawns of acceptance, she ultimately gave the world freely as a sanctuary where learning and beauty coexist. Walk the hushed halls of the Huntington Library and her shadow moves among the manuscripts. Stroll the rose-lined paths of San Marino and her willpower blooms in every petal. She was not the first woman to marry for advantage, nor the last, but few have ever turned private scandal into so public and enduring an inheritance. Her fortune bought diamonds and palaces, yet her true legacy rests in the galleries and gardens that still bear her name. The Astors and Vanderbilt's grand parties are long forgotten. Arabella's creation continues to educate, inspire, and console nearly 1 million visitors each year. Her life was neither simple nor saintly. She manipulated appearances, bent conventions, and made choices that invited whispers. But she also displayed extraordinary patience, resilience, and foresight. In an age when women were denied power, she found a way to claim it. Ambition without conscience can wound, vision without boldness never endures. To older eyes, her path may look ruthless. To younger generations, it may look like survival. And so we are left with the enduring tension she embodied. Was Arabella Huntington a strategist of rare brilliance who played the only cards available to her? Or, as critics claimed, a calculating climber who traded scandal for security? Perhaps she was both. Perhaps that is why her story still commands power, because it forces us to confront the uneasy truth that wealth, reputation, and legacy rarely walk the same road together. In every blossom and every manuscript, she leaves a final whisper. Scandal passes, but endurance remains. Her life forces a final question. Arabella's story is more than biography. It is a cautionary tale. Wealth without purpose evaporates. Reputation without resilience vanishes. But vision, even born in scandal, can endure. The question her life leaves us with is timeless. When family fortunes and human pride collide, what matters more? How we are judged in our own age, or what we leave to those who follow? As you reflect on her story, consider the tension in your own life between reputation and legacy, between ambition and duty. Which will endure longer? And which, in the end, do you wish to be remembered for?